Hey, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you are joining. My name is Rakesh Gupta, and I'm co-host of Automation Hour. I will go through first basic logistics and then hand over it to our today's speaker, Jay. Here are the logistics. All line will be muted. Please post your question in Salesforce Automation Hour Trailblazer community or here in GoToWebinar. Uh, you may want to follow us on the Salesforce Automation Hour and our website, automationhour.com, and YouTube channel so that you will get the recorded video link. We have only 2 sessions left in this year, and we started taking the session for next year. So if you want to present or if you have any use case or you know someone who can share their flow experience, please do share the session link with them. We are very thankful to our sponsor, Active Campaign, our Concrete IO. Without their help, it was not possible to bring this event to Ohana. Here are the co-founders, Jen, David, and I started Automation Hour in 2016 with an idea of helping people to learn Salesforce flows by taking different use cases from the communities. And here is your co-host, new co-host, Michelle Hansen and Rakesh Gupta. With that said, I am going to hand over it to Jay. So Jay, to you, sir.
Thank you very much. So happy to be here. Everyone, just so you're aware, I am reopening Chrome because I've had a little bit of computer problems the past week or two. I just received a new machine today, actually, that I haven't had time to crack open. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit before I get my slides up so that we're not wasting time. I'll take presentation rights in just a moment, Rakesh. So hello, everyone. I am Jay Stedman. I am a lead admin evangelist at Salesforce. I have been working in Salesforce technology since about 2012. I've focused specifically on declarative development and process automation for a long time. I've been here twice on the Automation Hour in the past and have had a blast. And I'm really happy to be here today to discuss the limits of flow. And I've got my slides up. That's great. And let's show my screen. Hey, look at that. We coming through okay?
Looks great.
Perfect. Thank you very much for the confirmation. Let's talk about being flow friendly and learning the limits that we have for flow. Moving forward, I wanted to say thank you to everyone. This has been a particularly big deal for me. I know that we do this a lot at Salesforce, but in general, 2020 and 2021 have just been really difficult years for me. The Salesforce community, all of you Flownatics, everyone in the Ohana, everyone that's here at Automation Hour, and everyone that's at Salesforce have been a huge bright spot for me. And I really love seeing everyone come together and constantly lift each other up and challenge each other's knowledge and make sure that we're building the best solutions possible and doing it with this kind of unique energy that we all have. So thank you for that. I always appreciate the opportunity to share how I'm feeling about y'all whenever I'm here in front of y'all. This is a picture of me. So today I'm a little bit sick. You may hear me cough a couple of times. I'm not going to pop on camera as a consequence of that. I feel a little ugly today, you guys. I'm COVID negative, which is great, but not feeling super awesome. So I'm going to stay off camera. And I've already told you just a little bit about myself and my background. A couple of fun facts. I love playing the drums and I'm super into esoteric board games. So let's talk about why we're here today, what it is that we're going to cover, why we're going to cover it, and why it matters to y'all. So our agenda today, I think, is pretty simple. We're going to start with the limitations that we've got in flow, specifically governor limits. We're going to talk about what governor limits are, why they're important. We're going to review some limit types. It's not going to be an exhaustive list, but I do think it's going to cover the most frequently run into limits with Flow Builder. We're going to talk over considerations as you're constructing flows, and then I'll talk over a few resources that I think are good to reference as you're trying to continue to build your flows more efficiently and make sure that you're avoiding errors. The deck will be made available after the presentation, so you can screenshot if you want, but you aren't required to. And if you have any questions, Of course, we can pause at the end for Q&A, but if you have questions and you'd like to raise them during the presentation, I'm absolutely okay with that as well. You know, if you want to throw them in the chat, and then perhaps they could be presented over to me, and we could deal with them as we go. So with that being said, let me grab a sip of water and let's go.
Well, Jay, while you're grabbing that sip of water, I just want to let you know that Cindy chimed in with "You are always beautiful, Jay," and she hopes you feel better soon.
Oh, y'all, I love it. Thank you. Great. So let's talk about flow limits, specifically the Salesforce platform. I'm starting here with an incredibly dubious quote. Showers for everyone. I've attributed this quote to Parker Harris, probably. So why am I saying that Parker Harris says everyone should have a shower? This has to do with our platform, right? Salesforce is a multi-tenant service. We are a SaaS company. We provide cloud applications that customers all over the world can use. They can use it all simultaneously, and they each have their own org. But I really like this metaphor the best. So I imagine Parker Harris not developing software, but developing an apartment building, and he's really, you know, concerned about everyone getting water for their showers. And he's got a limited supply of water that he's able to hold on hand. And he's got all of these apartments, and everyone deserves a shower. So we take a look at who's sitting in apartment 1, and that apartment 1 says, yo, I want all the water to come up. I want to have a 700-gallon bath, right? And Parker was really smart. Parker installed a valve so that apartment 1 cannot take 100% of the water that is inside the apartment building's water cache. And then helpfully sends a little letter. Hey, here's why we shut off your water, and it's because we want apartment 2 and apartment 3 to remain happy. So that's a great metaphor, right? Yes, thank you. It's fantastic. But if we step out of the metaphor and we step into Salesforce as a system, really what Parker is saying is record retrieval for everyone. That water cache is the resources that we have on our platform. Things like CPU time, processing power, the number of times that we're going back to the database, the number of times that we're asking questions of the database. And Salesforce has customers, Salesforce, the company, has customers using our products that are across the entire spectrum of size. So when I started off as a Salesforce administrator, we had 36 licenses. When I stopped being a Salesforce administrator and I joined Salesforce, the company, my org had 3,500 licenses. And it's really important that everyone has the opportunity to access their database, update, delete records from their database, gets access to CPU and make sure that they're actually able to process the requests that they're making, right? So when you run into these dreaded SOWL queries errors that you may see if you're building out flows, the intention here is this is a platform built for all customers, not just those that want to use most of the stuff, right? So great, we've talked about some dubious quotes from Parker that he probably didn't say, but really fit my story quite well. Now let's ask the question, why does this matter? Because you might be asking it. So the first thing is you may have heard from Dreamforce to today, we have talked about the end of the line for Process Builder. We have talked about the end of the line for workflow rules. And while they're still off there on the horizon, I have really observed a significant amount of anxiety, and I've had a lot of conversations with folks out in the community about getting into Flow. There are folks that really think of Flow as a developer-only tool, and I was really surprised to hear that. And lastly, you're about to be absolutely inundated, covered in resources all about Flow. As Salesforce, the company, and our various admin relations, dev relations, our marketing teams, as we all gear up for this end of life of Process Builder and workflow rules, you're going to see a large number of articles, blog posts, videos, and other kinds of content coming out, and the community is going to do the same thing, right? So there's going to be tons of stuff to read, and I think it's really important that we focus on some foundational aspects of how is flow governed? How should we build flow? To demystify and to kind of take the teeth out of Flow Builder and building flows. Because really the most important reason that why this should matter is because you, as admins and developers and other people in the Salesforce community, you absolutely deserve to be able to access technology, right? The advent of declarative technology was really to democratize and give access to a wide amount of users. It just so happens that we need to know the rules that govern these tools like Flow Builder so that we can use them to the best of our ability. And as an admin evangelist and just as a person, like I believe every one of us that's on this call can do it and should do it, right? Because it super helps our business, right? I think helping the business and making sure that the business is as efficient as possible is really important. So as I've covered the why this matters, I also want to highlight the fact that I am pointing out some stuff that folks on the call may already be familiar with, and other folks on the call may be hearing for the first time. Essentially, what I want everyone in the Salesforce community to do that's using Flow Builder is to have the same body of knowledge about limits so that we can build high quality flows moving forward. So if this isn't as advanced as you'd like, I beg your patience. And if this is too advanced for you, I beg your patience. I think it's a good place to start our conversation. I'm going to pause for water and any questions that may pop up.
Okay, we do have one come in from Jamie. Maybe you'll get to this later, but asking ahead of time. I love flow and want to streamline what we are doing, but not being able to call subflows and before create flows makes it really hard for me to create a flow that makes any sense at all. What do you suggest?
Well, I think I have a little challenge because I'm not sure that I agree with the thesis. I don't see a requirement to have subflows being called from before save flows right now to be a deal breaker to use Flow Builder. This is a personal preference thing, and it's off the topic that we're presenting today. But I do think it's valuable to point this out. We are fully investing all of our resources in developing future features on Flow Builder, right? So if you look at the changes that have happened in the past 2 years at Salesforce, the number of features that have come into Flow, it's massive. And I think that we should continue to see that expand. Without specific roadmap knowledge, what I'd say is, I think the feature that you're calling out, having the access to grab subflows and call them in a before save flow, I think it's probably a matter of time before we get there. But nevertheless, process builder and workflow rules, they're still out the window eventually. So what we really need to do is focus on what we can do in Flow as we continue to think about the way that we want flows to be enhanced. And I know that's a little bit of a wiggly answer, but I hope you'll give me a little bit of leeway in that, it's the tool that we got. And as we add features, they'll become available to all of us. Any other questions? No?
Justin chimed in with Flow has changed my life as an admin. I can do things I never thought I would be able to do unless I used code. And yeah, let's see. Jamie followed up with, we have some very complicated formulas, etc., and processes that would make a flow very large, which doesn't seem optimal. So, but
yeah, I think that's an interesting observation, is saying like, hey, we could build this out, but I don't think it would be optimal. First, I would say whenever I'm building flows, I'm always looking for opportunities to enhance the flows that I build, right? So they become optimized over time. Sometimes your V1 is not as elegant as you would like it to be, but eventually you can get them there as features become available or as you become more familiar with the tool, right? Certainly we can't totally overcome a feature disparity, but very frequently what I found is I'm able to go back to flows that I've created and optimize them to have a few less elements or to be a little bit more modular. And I try to apply those things when and as I'm able.
Perfect. All right.
Cool.
I think we're good for now.
I want to start with two really abstract sounding terms as it pertains to flow. We have interviews and we have transactions. These are important terms for everyone on the call to know. And we're going to take a look at the definition of this, but then we're going to break it out of the definition so it's a little bit less odd. So what is an interview? An interview is a running instance of a flow. When you run a flow interview, Whether through a link, a button, or a tab, you are running a single instance of a flow. Each flow interview runs in the context of a transaction. A transaction represents a set of operations that are executed as a single unit. For example, a transaction can execute apex triggers and escalation rules in addition to a flow interview. I'm including this so that people have reference to it after the call. It's a lot of text and it's a kind of dense explanation. So instead, let's take a look at an example of interviews and transactions. So in this case, we're going to reference an inciting event, what has happened in our Salesforce instance. And we're going to say that a case has been saved. Now, when that case is saved, a number of Salesforce things are fired in the background. Now, in our business case here, what we're going to say is when I save my case, I have an apex trigger that is going to fire before save. I have some assignment rules. I have a process builder that's going to update a field, and then I have a flow that's going to do some work on some related objects. All of those things exist within my transaction. Where I have flow in the fourth box, that's one flow interview. In certain circumstances, you might have multiple flow interviews all in the same transaction. It depends on how many flows that you have that would execute when a case is saved. The same thing is true for process, right? If we have 12 process builders for every case saved, then we're going to have 12 individual processes running in this transaction, right? So a case is saved, a transaction full of interviews is processed, and the things inside that transaction are our triggers, our assignment rules, our processes, and our flows. And when we hit a limit, all of that stuff shuts down. And not only does it shut down, it also gets rolled back. So when I talk about rollback, if I save a case and I have a trigger that sends an email, and I have assignment rules that are assigning the case to a certain rep, and I've got a process that's updating a field and a flow that is updating child records. If I encounter a too many SOWL queries error, for example, 100% of those things that I just listed out do not happen. We roll back the transaction and everything in the transaction. It's not as though just our flow is stopped. Many of us are in orgs that are more and more complicated every day, and many of us have orgs that have the involvement of consultants and developers and other admins, and it can be really difficult to know who is doing what. But if we view our automation and if we view flow through this lens of the transaction, it really explains a lot of friction that admins and developers can experience as they're working together. Because essentially everyone is sharing that same resource, but we might not be developing with that in mind. And if devs are, only thinking of themselves as consuming the resources, and if admins are only thinking of themselves as consuming these resources, neither party gets what they want, and everyone has an error that they don't quite understand. So when we have considerations for our interviews and our transactions, we really need to think about how many operations are tied to the transaction, right? Are you an org that has 3 or 4 or 5 triggers that are all firing in the same way on the same object, or flows or process builders? Each one of those is considered an operation that's contained within your interview or within your transaction. It's also really important to combine or consolidate those operations when and where possible. This is that classic case where we've talked a long time about the number of process builders that you may have that are triggered in a certain context, or the number of flows that might be firing, or the number of apex triggers, right? Combine and consolidate operations when and where possible. And then lastly, on top of that communication and consolidation, making sure that you're communicating with other folks who may be consuming these same resources in the same context. Upping that communication will definitely help everyone have fewer collisions as you're sharing these resources. And you know what? Sometimes you'll have communication with IT and you'll determine that it is best to go with code. And in other times you might find out that, oh, heck, there was just this little operation happening over there. The devs say that they don't actually need to do it. It could be in the flow that I'm working on. And what you've done is had a good communication. You've optimized your software, your application, and you've reduced the number of resources that are being consumed. So that concludes our little section about interviews and transactions. Want to pause again for water. Really, it's all about the water for me, but also if you have questions.
Okay, we've got a bunch that are rolling in, so I'm gonna try and cherry pick as we get through these. So SOWL pops up with, we constantly have issues where we are running into Apex CPU time limit exceeded errors. Do you have any pointers for this?
Yeah, so stack tracing. When I was an admin sitting at my large org, when I ran into a CPU limit error, we'd have to find out like, where is this being thrown from? It could be that Apex is calling something that is calling something that is calling something. It could be recursive. It could end up calling itself. So really what I would do in a sandbox is I would try and break down each and every piece of the automation. Why does it break the way that it broke? And I'd also tried a series of different contexts to see, what is it specifically that's causing this error that I'm receiving? Is it volume? Can I save a single record? Is it a matter of the number of records that I'm trying to process? Is there something specific to one kind of change that I'm making or a particular field that's triggering that recursion and then causing you to burn through your CPU? So those would be the places that I'd start. But I mean, the general recommendation is get it into a sandbox and just try to break it and reproduce the error so that you can understand what's happening.
Perfect. Okay. Let's see. Hi team, any thoughts on flow creation frameworks to keep flows organized and quote, keep the water running efficiently, quote, on the platform, from Anthony.
So I think that we are absent having one solid like best practice framework that that Apex has had for a while. I think the important thing for any org to do is to be consistent with how you do stuff and to have your own style guide for how you want your IT partners and any consultants that you work with and other team members to build things in the same way. In other words, knowing when you choose what solution and making sure that everyone is doing that really, really consistently, and then making sure that you're including the same things with a pattern that you and your organization agree on, right? For example, you could have one flow per object, and then you could have modular subflows that you call from underneath that, and that's your standard. My recommendation is to find the standard for you right now, absent some kind of larger framework to be recommended, and make sure that you stay consistent with that. Pay attention to other frameworks that may exist and incorporate what changes you think would be best for your org.
Excellent. I've got maybe two more that we'll take now based on where we're at. So is there a tool to help us understand what is being fired when a record is created, updated, or deleted on objects, or is there a recommendation for how to get started is what Justin would like to know.
Debug logs are going to be the answer there. And there are various resources that you can dig into on debug logs. That's going to show you exactly what happens when a particular action is taken with a record. And you can set your debug logs to have different levels of granularity for a variety of different categories, including things like Apex and workflow, which would include flow here. And by going through that debug log in the developer console, you'd be able to review how a lot of this stuff is consumed. And we'll look at a few other examples in just a few moments.
Cool. Okay, so along with this framework, basically Zach and Doug both came up with the same version, similar versions of the same question. So Doug, I've received mixed messages on this. Should record triggered flows be one per object like Process Builder, or is it recommended that you don't do this? And Zach's version of that question is it better to have different flows with different starting criteria or a single flow with many decision elements? Which I know Diana kind of mentioned on the last Release Readiness Live. So, but I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, so I don't actually think that there's a one size fits all for this, especially because elements consumed at runtime is one of the limits that we're going to talk about on this call. I can tell you what I prefer to do, which is to have a flow per object, and then I like to invoke other flows beneath that as I need to. That isn't going to work in all cases, and it's definitely not going to work in cases where the subflows aren't available yet. But that's my preference, right? It's very rare when I build any kind of flow that it's just one flow. It's usually 5 or 6 flows that all interact with one another, and then they can be called by whatever my main triggering flow is.
Okay, I think that probably takes care of us for now, and we'll save some of the rest until you get a little further along in the presentation.
Sure. I'd also say, just because you mentioned Diana, she has all the insight in the universe and is, deeply in the seat of power on Flow. So give great reverence to anything that she may recommend, because she knows the technology better than almost anyone. Probably everyone. Well, maybe the engineers and then Diana. I don't know. I'll say it's equal, just to be safe. All right. So that takes us out of interviews and transactions. And I start with interview and transactions because I think that's really the place that you have to start before you can understand how these other limits are calculated. So the next limit that we're going to talk about is Salesforce Object Query Language. You'll see it everywhere as SOWL. Very few people actually type out Salesforce Object Query Language, but if you're new to it, I think it's important to know that's what it is. It's similar to SQL, but not exactly the same. Now, when we're using SOWL, how do we define that, right? Anytime that we are retrieving information from the Salesforce database and retaining that in memory, we are querying, right? That is a SOWL query. We've consumed one query. We've asked the database a question. We ask that question if we look up a single field value, a whole record's worth of field values, or a huge collection of records. It does not matter whether it's one field, one record, or many records. It is one query. Now, there are limits associated with SOWL. You get 100 queries per transaction and 50,000 retrieved records per transaction. So this takes us to the question of how does Flow consume these limits? Well, anytime that you use a get records element, you're going to consume one SOWL query within Flow. If you use an update records element or a delete records element, and you include a filter criteria, those elements will also consume a query, right? So this ties limit consumption directly to some of the elements that you can drag and drop into your flow on the canvas. Get records elements. You can just tell yourself right now, anytime that you drag a get records element onto the canvas, that's just one SOWL query that I've used. If you've included filters on your update records or delete records, you have just consumed a query against the database, right? I think it's important to think about that as you're assembling your flows. And when we look at the limits of 100 queries per transaction, and we take a moment and go back to what can sit in a single transaction, what you'll find is that we have to be really, really mindful, not just of our stuff, but of the entire org's stuff, right? This is where we think about things like our Apex triggers, et cetera. So as a consequence, when we're using SOWL, how can we use it the most efficiently? First, you want to avoid any get records elements within a loop. In general, when it comes to patterns, you want to avoid get records, you want to avoid update records, delete records inside of a loop. In a perfect world, the only thing that we see inside of a loop pattern, it's assignments. You're just assigning values back and forth. And then outside of the loop, you can go ahead and get your records. Because when records are looped, you're going to consume one SOWL query for each record that's processed, right? That means 3 records, 3 SOWL queries. You only get 100. So avoiding putting a get records element within a loop is really important. You can also combine your get records elements where possible. So if you're getting accounts and then later in the same flow, getting more accounts, if it's possible to combine those, do so. That will limit the number of queries that you consume. And then lastly, I recommend using running context. Whenever you're able to access running context information, that's anything that's got the $sign. For example, $record dot. There's a lot of really rich information in there that can tell you about a record that caused the flow to fire. You can do the same thing with the running user, running profile. Getting those things from that running record variable, it doesn't actually cost you a SOWL query. So do recommend using that when you can. So that's our brief discussion on SOWL. Pause here for any SOWL related queries. And water.
Okay, fun times. All right, so we've got several questions around this. So from Maria, if we go across an object relationship like opportunity to account to type, is that one query on the opportunity or two opportunity and account?
So it's one query. Technically, I think since you're looking through the field, I think it's on the initial object that you look through, but regardless of the number of objects that you're going through, it's one query. It wouldn't charge you two because you're hopping an object over. I think that there is a limit to the number of jumps you can make inside of an object, but I'd need to check the documentation to be specific on what it is.
Okay. All right, so next one. If we have to update the $sign record, do we still use an assignment before?
Yes. Well, so I suppose it depends on how you're constructing it. You can, in update records, you can set values. I think it's probably down to your preference. I personally like to use assignments, but you know, as we think about the runtime elements combined, if it's a large flow and you're doing a lot of records, just want to be mindful about how many elements that you're adding. So if you don't need the assignment, certainly it would help you to remove it.
Okay, so next up, oh, I'm losing questions here. What about decisions in a loop?
So decisions in a loop, I suppose you're going to cause yourself a really complex situation, I suppose. I mean, if you're trying to find out, hey, there are some records that I do want to process, some records that I don't want to process, and you're using it as a way to kind of filter out some records, I guess I would ask why you wouldn't do it beforehand. If you include it in the loop, it will be processed times the number of records that are processed. So really, to the best of my ability, I try and keep things just to assignments, where I'm assigning stuff from one variable to another inside of a loop.
But it doesn't count against your query limits, right?
It would, the decision? No, decisions don't count against query limits at all.
Okay. Do we want to take more loop questions now, or do we want to defer those?
We'll talk a little bit about loops with DML as well. So let's go ahead and pause that until after DML.
Okay. One more question that came in, and Cindy would like to know, is there a plan to offer a super badge using Flow?
You know what? I'm not connected enough to that team to know. I mean, there is the process automation specialist super badge, and that includes some Flow stuff, but it's not Flow specific, I suppose.
Okay, and then Jen Lee is actually on our call today. So she wanted to chime in with just an FYI, they will be updating the record triggered decision guide with the framework question in the future for how to build your flows. So the answer really is it depends on your org and your needs. So Salesforce is not saying like Apex triggers or processes that you should stick to one per object.
Gotcha.
So that is the
that's fantastic.
latest
Jen,
official.
in addition to being one of the founders of Automation Hour, she's actually on my team. So thank you very much, Jen. Jen is like super connected to the Flow team, and she's got a lot of really great content planned for all y'all. So there, gave me an opportunity to reference all of the amazing that you can look forward to from Jen.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to ask this one. I think it fits, but if not, we can always table it. So if records are updated in bulk and trigger an after save record change flow, does that execute in bulk as well, or does it run a single interview against each record that was updated by, let's say, data loader? Doug is not able to find any official information about this.
So there is official information about this. If you type in Salesforce Flow bulkification into Google, it should take you to a help and training article that explains how Flow bulkifies things. The answer is when and where possible, it holds at certain elements before taking an action. So before updating the database, for example, it will wait to collect all of the records that need to be included in that action, therefore being more efficient with the consumption of your limits.
Perfect. Okay, I think that gets us pretty good for now. We'll hold the rest for later.
Amazing. Okay, so let's take a look at DML, database manipulation language. We're going to break down the same framework here. We've got a definition, we've got the specific limits, and then we talk about how Flow consumes it. So DML is when we change the database, and we change the database by creating a new record, updating a new record by editing and saving it, or deleting a record. This is going to be true if we change a single field value on that record, or if we modify a large number of records, right? So if we've edited one record in Flow, that consumed one DML statement. If we delete 1,000 records from production, that could be a single DML statement. And we talk about the limits that we have for DML. Oh, wow, Ben. Hello, everyone. That is Ben, my little brother from Big Brothers Big Sisters. Okay, yeah, sorry about that. Knocked me off my swag for a second. There we go. Okay, what are our limits? 150 statements per transaction, right? Again, remember transactions include more than just your flow, right? And 10,000 records can be processed per transaction as well. So how does Flow consume this stuff, right? If we're using a create records element, if we're using an update records element or a delete records element, we will be consuming DML statements, right? And because DML is going to be changing something in the database, you are going to be consuming statements and processed records, right? So when we think about considerations for DML, we again want to avoid DML within a loop. Instead, we want to collect everything into a collection variable by assigning it. And then outside of the loop, we want to use our DML element. We want to combine elements that use DML wherever possible. And then lastly, you want to consider data volume. 10,000 records isn't tiny, but it's certainly, it's not enormous for the number of like bulk actions that admins and developers are asked to take. So it may be that the data volume that you're working with, if it's over 10,000 records, you may say to yourself, okay, I need to talk to a developer and maybe we can work on some Apex stuff together. Time to pause, time to question, time to conversate.
Love it. Okay, so I've got a couple of general questions that I will hold still, but we have not forgotten them, I promise. So Kenny wants to know, is there any reason not to store all fields when querying records as opposed to storing fields separately? That is his favorite feature in Flow that is not available in Apex. My 2 cents on this, I have no idea why you would actually declare variables and fields anymore. I always go for just let Salesforce store it all. But Jay, what's your official answer here?
So I'm speaking officially as Jay, unofficially as a Salesforce employee, right? I don't, again, the same thing goes with my previous answer about like, hey, what's best? I'm not sure that we have solid guidance on like, hey, this is what you should do and why. I do think that there is a question of ease of use. So like it's easier to just, I don't have to, think about my naming conventions or create and manage a bunch of variables. At the same time, it may be that you like your naming conventions for variables and it's easier for you to find. Believe it or not, I actually fall into that bucket sometimes with my flows. Like getting a system generated variable is great, but if I'm using half a dozen variables, it can get a little confusing for me. The only consideration I would say, and I don't think this is the case, but I'd be interested in knowing the question. So I'm raising this as an open question and one that I don't actually know the answer of, is does dealing with a larger number of stuff stored in memory increase how much time it takes to process something if we're talking columns, not rows, right? So if I capture 48 attributes, does that process a little bit slower than 12 attributes? I don't actually know the answer to that question, and I haven't seen any benchmark data showing us what would be the answer to that.
Sure. So my personal theory on this is that it's there so older flows that were created before that was there could be displayed and basically managed within that flow builder, because essentially the naming convention for using, account from get account is different than whatever you would have named before, and you'd have to
Yeah,
rename every reference in your flow if they got rid of that. So that's my personal theory.
yeah,
But
that's true. That's true.
yeah, still have no idea what you do it anymore. Okay, Sal would like to know if you could please explain if there's any sort of limits with loops. And the question is there a 200 record limit?
Yeah, so we'll actually be talking about this directly next. So I wanted to talk about the framework surrounding our limits, and that was our interviews in our transactions. And then I wanted to focus on 3 key limits during today's conversation. The third is the limit of elements that you can have at runtime, which is on our very next slide. I'm happy to kind of use this as a lead-in if there are no other DML specific questions.
There are, so Sal will hold that one
Let's
for
do it.
just a second.
We'll hold that.
Okay, so Zach would like to know, does a before save field update consume a DML statement?
Ooh.
I think the answer is no, but I don't know what the answer is now that they did it with an update records as opposed to with just an assignment.
So the answer, actually, I had a recent interaction about this with Andy and with Diana. So it's not going to consume a query for you. And they changed it under the hood. The reason that it was changed under the hood is for consistency's sake. So no matter what we're doing, we want to use an update element so that the UI is consistent across all flow types, right? Previous to that change, it was an assignment element, but under the hood, it's the same thing. So we're not actually consuming DML to make that happen.
Perfect, okay. Doug wants to know, where is the $ record collection in a record change flow for bulk operations?
So it's going to be dependent on how you've constructed your elements, what's going to appear for you, because a lot of that is auto-handled. I specific to single records or fields on a single record. I'm not sure that I've recently worked with a $ record collection.
I don't know that I've actually ever seen one.
Yeah, it might have to be handled through, maybe you'd loop it so that you could see individual records. Not a solid answer, just a kind of an exploration of thought.
Okay. Let's see here. When we add a new user to Salesforce, we also create a contact for them, but I get a DML error when I try to combine actions in flow on users with actions on another object. Is there a way around that or a reason for it? That's from Jamie.
So
I
that
know
sounds to
Jen
me
has a
like
phenomenal blog post on this, by the way.
good. Go see Jen's blog post. But it sounds to me like there's multiple. It sounds to me like there are multiple actions that are happening upon that condition of save, and combined, they're exceeding your DML limit.
Actually, it's a mixed DML error because it's on user and then on contact and users.
There it is. There it is.
Yep.
Yep.
So the easiest way around that, and Jen, keep me honest, throw a pause element or a screen element in there somewhere, and that will basically stop it and create a new transaction so you avoid that mixed DML error. And if I can find Jen's blog, I will throw the URL in here, but if you Google Jen Lee and mixed DML, I'm absolutely certain you'll find it.
Perfect.
Or an at future action to a subflow. And Aiden, I appreciate you for throwing that my way, so I'll share that link out.
Yep.
I think we were probably solid for you to go ahead, and we'll hold more questions.
Cool. The last thing I'd say on that topic is that there are, so since I've become a Salesforce employee, which has been a few years, and when I make these like publicly available presentations, there are a few things that I try to avoid recommending because they're kind of working around, you hear like, hey, you can hack this or you can work around that. Just because I work at Salesforce, I try and avoid some of that conversation. Now I've like taken it on myself because I don't want people to think that it's actually us recommending to like do workarounds. But when you called out, screen elements, pause elements, all you need to do is commit the transaction, right? So if you were to type in Salesforce flow, how to end a transaction, you'll get a number of different community resources, you'll get some clarification from help and training, and that will help you better understand when you can get a transaction to commit and why you would want it to commit. And you can also include things like counting, right? So as we talk about our runtime elements, you could have a variable that kind of counts how many elements have been consumed, and that could be a part of this transaction commitment process that you set up. Worth noting to everyone, screen flows, whenever you have a screen, a new interview starts up every time it uses a screen, which can also be helpful. Okay, runtime elements. These are the number of elements used at runtime. So the definition of this is the number of elements in the flow that are actually processed, right? Elements that are reused, such as loops and any logic that might be inside of a loop, will be counted multiple times. That's because it's counted for each time a record is processed. So in the chat, there was this question about, hey, is there a limit to looping? Well, the limit to runtime elements is 2,000 elements, right? And each element is going to consume one of this limitation. Now, if I've got a loop, and the loop has the assignment element for a record, and then another assignment element for a collection, I'll be consuming 3 elements per record, in addition to the rest of the flow, right? So if I have 300 records, I will consume 900 elements. You can see how this starts to get sticky really, really fast, right? So we want to be incredibly mindful of what we put inside of a flow. We want to be incredibly mindful of the number of records that we process. You have to be really mindful of data volumes, especially when you're running transformation on that data, like you're changing field values, you're looping through record by record. You may consider reducing the number of records processed. I reference a workaround here. You can use a number variable. You can do anything that would cause a transaction to be committed to the database, or anything that would cause a new interview to begin. And you may consider, if you've got something that takes up tons and tons and tons of elements, it may be something that you can narrowly target to become an apex action or an invocable method. I'm a really big fan of talking to my developers and say, hey, most of my flow here is fantastic, but I am burning through tons of queries doing this thing, or I'm using too many elements over there, and having them develop something that just, it fits the use case. And hopefully I could pull it out of, account flow and put it into a contact flow, because there's some reusability there as well. It may not be that the Apex action can suit your needs. You might actually need to go with an Apex class. So you'll have to consider that as you get to larger and larger flows that are processing larger and larger numbers of records. Tell me your questions.
Okay, so I think that definitely should have answered Sal's question. It's 2,000 for the whole flow, so loops are a fun thing. Actually, our 2 automation hours ago, we presented on a topic on how to kind of get around this by using a platform event architecture. So I would definitely, if you've got tons of large data volumes, recommend you look at that. All right, so some more questions.
Such a connector. You are such a connector. You're connecting everyone to all the great ideas. It's amazing.
It's all Jen's fault. Just blame Jen. Speaking of Jen, she said they are planning to redo the process automation super badge in light of the retirement of workflow rules and processes in the future. So it will cover more on flow.
Oh, good. I love that.
It's great having y'all on these calls. We get to learn so much fun things. Okay. So Chris has this scenario or conundrum. To reduce the number of elements that run, I need to exit a loop before all records are processed. So if the loop has 100 records, it would reduce elements run if I can exit the loop after the 3rd record when a decision is met. So how can you exit a loop so it doesn't continue to the next record?
Yeah, you can, at the loop, you can iterate a number variable to just add 1 to the number. And then you can set a decision element to say, when this variable equals a number of my choosing, do not go the direction of the loop and end, right? In other words, if n equals 25, go to path B. That's the workaround that I'm referencing here.
Okay, so basically if I'm looking for a specific record out of the 100, I don't know if it's going to be number 3 or number 25. So I just need to know when I find that record that I was looking for, I've got what I need and I don't need to keep looping over everything else. So can you do the same sort of thing with a decision and some sort of like maybe a Boolean variable that says found
Yeah.
what I was looking for?
Yeah, it could really be anything, right? I mean, what I'm hearing is I need to look at a number of records and then stop based on criteria. The answer would be you need a variable to hold that criteria, and then you need a decision to compare that criteria to, right? By including those two things in your flow, you'll be able to exit the loop. The only question is whether or not you'll ever be in a situation where you're going to burn out your runtime elements limit, right? If it's ever going to exceed 2000, you would want to make sure that you are exiting beforehand. But if you are only dealing with, tens of records at a time, it shouldn't be a problem.
Excellent. Okay, so we've got a couple more people chiming in on mixed DML issues. So to avoid mixed DML, Winter 22 includes the ability to run updates asynchronously. So look at using an async path for one and the run immediately path for the other, potentially. Thank you for that, Anthony, and a couple other people. So unofficial SF collection actions are a godsend for a lot of these things. That was Justin's comment, and I agree that is one of the greatest sites ever. Maria would like to know, do scheduled flows that run on a large volume get bulkified? Like say it runs once a day and sends in 14,000 accounts.
Yeah, so that it gets bulkified and it also runs async, right? So your results won't be immediate, but it's handled. You can process more because it's processed in an async way.
Okay, so both bulkified for you and asynchronous.
Mm-hmm. Also worth noting here, and I've been thinking about this for a while, right? I think that unofficial SF is a fantastic, innovative site where you can consume tons of new and very exciting content and enhancements for your own use with Flow. I would say because it is not official product, right? It's that unofficial stuff. Since you're using code, most of the time it's code that you're able to download. If you're ever trying to use that in your production instance, do make sure that you sandbox the heck out of it. You've got a team of developers or a developer that will look at it and make sure that the code meets your own standards in the org. It's just always something in the back of my mind, right? I've been a big fan of the site for a long time as well. But when we think about using it in production instances, I think it's really important that we vet it as deeply as we're able to make sure that it's going to really give us everything we hope it will.
Absolutely. I mean, obviously it's not official Salesforce, that's why it's unofficial Salesforce. So
Yep,
for sure. Okay. Here's a fun question. Doug, I don't think you can based on what I've tried, but I'd love an official answer to this too. Doug would like to know, can you add a record variable to a collection in the same assignment that you update the record variable or set the values? I don't want to use another assignment element just to add it to a collection. I think I've tried this and I think it fails.
Yeah, to the best of my knowledge, that is not possible. The standard pattern for a loop when dealing with collections is loop element, assignment element to change whatever's in the running record, and then another assignment element for adding it to the collection.
Excellent. Okay. Ethan said, thanks for sharing about the scheduled flows. What about scheduled paths within a record triggered flow? I've seen a 1 minute scheduled path take up to 10 minutes before. Is this due to running async or how are these running?
Yeah, I think anything under an hour is actually going to just be run async, I think. Jen may actually have more up-to-date information than that, but like if you type in a 0 hour pause element, for example, it's not going to happen instantaneously. It just kicks it into the async lands.
So if I remember correctly, it basically gets added to like an async queue.
Yep.
And so when the system has time to run whatever is in the queue, it starts running it. So if there's more stuff in that asynchronous queue before what you put into it without 1 minute, it will not run before a minute, but it could run at 1 minute or at any point after a minute when resources get freed up.
Yep.
Okay. All right, I think that gets us good for now.
Cool. Well, we're coming up on the hour, and I think we've only got a few slides left. Hey, use the sandbox. I just kind of touched this a little bit, touched on it a little bit when we were talking about unofficial Salesforce, but I've had recent conversations that have continued my understanding that there are some orgs that are kind of flowing free directly in production, especially as we talk about things like limit consumption and being aware of other development efforts or operations that can be happening in your org and how they compound the use of resources and the, the success or failure of your flows. Test stuff in a sandbox, build it in a sandbox, build it element by element, and take a look at how it's consuming resources. Use a sandbox. I'm talking to you, the person in the audience right now that doesn't use a sandbox. Use a sandbox. It's time. Okay, let's talk about resources. How do we better understand limits? So first, there's tons of documentation on help and training. There's a really comprehensive list of what is consumed, where it's consumed, and why it's consumed. A lot of what we've seen here, I drew from that and then kind of broke it down so that it was a little less H&T. Next, you've got Flow Debugger. So Flow Debugger is a really great way to see how many elements are being consumed. I'm sorry, how many limits are being consumed by element, right? So element by element, you can review, hey, how many records were retrieved? Hey, how many records were deleted? It's a really fantastic way to see what's going item by item. I use this as I'm building because I tend to build and test element by element to make sure that I'm getting the behavior I want. Dev Console gives you not only the elements, the limits per element, but also you can see total limit consumption across your entire flow or your entire transaction. So you'd have to go into setup, choose the developer console, and then you would want to change your debug log setting so that workflow was sent to the finer setting. And this will give you the information that you're looking for from workflow. The other settings are up to you based on what you need in your org. If you've got a lot of Apex or whatever and you want to see that going, I leave what you set the other columns to you. And then there are tons of community posts, right? You may have heard of this person called Jen Lee, but there's also Force Panda, lots of posts there. And I think that there's another rising star in the blog community right now. Flow.
Probably Engen Utkin.
Oh yeah, Engen as well. Yeah. Yep. So lots of Flow content out there, tons of community posts. And when we make this deck available, I can make these clickable links so that y'all can get more information about them or see some things that I've recommended. That's the end of this slide, which takes me to this slide where I say thank you again. How fun has this been? What other questions you got?
Oh, you know they're keeping coming. All right. So with respect to what we just had, Maria said, could you spell out that last blog? Are you looking for Andy Engen, Maria? I got you there. Okay. So here we go. Wei would like to know, what would you recommend when there are triggers for managed packages involved?
Yeesh. So this is going to be kind of a general answer, right? I think the way that this presentation was structured, and my personal belief is that you just need to know what's happening in your org. And I think you've done a great job of pointing out something that I just didn't include in the conversation, which is there are other factors at play here as well. If you've got a managed package that contains a trigger and that trigger is vital to your day-to-day business, you need to consider it to be a part of the transactions that your org runs. And if it consumes a lot of stuff, you have to make the decision as to whether or not you're getting the value that you're looking for, right? The cost is limit consumption and the value is the business benefit that you get from it. It sucks to say that sometimes you might have a managed package and then you might try and run something and could get a limit exceeded. But yeah, basically what I'd say is you want to be aware first and foremost so that you can make educated decisions about where you allocate those resources.
Perfect. Okay, so let's see. Patrick, told you we would not forget your question. So I think here's a good place for it. Patrick says he's the sole admin of an 8-person nonprofit. They had 100+ workflow rules and processes when he came on last year, and he's begun converting them to flows, mostly with success. They're mostly simple field updates, email alerts, but a few have had problems conflicting with our work or not directly migratable. So the question is it possible to have a flow helpline rather than opening a support ticket every time he runs into a snag?
Oh goodness. I thought we were going to go into like technical stuff there. I don't think that we have a flow helpline. In fact, I'm not sure that there's a phone number. I'm not aware of any publicly facing phone number for calls. So I think the answer is that a ticket is probably where you're going to go, but it is important to note that support is going to be supporting flows very soon. This has been announced recently. So you should expect more comprehensive assistance if you're running into trouble with your flows.
Yes, I will also put a plug in here for joining Ohana Slack.
Yeah.
There is a processes channel there with tons of crazy people like me who love nothing more than to help figure out conundrums when it comes to flow. So one of the things Salesforce has done amazingly well is build a community full of people willing to support other users and admins. And so I cannot say enough good things about what it did for my career. And join Ohana Slack. We will help. I will snag a link to that while Jay answers our next question. So Doug has a couple. We'll start with this one. Will maps be available in flows?
Probably. Are we saying Salesforce maps like the product, or are we saying like maps like you'd like to have an interactive map in flow?
Apex maps is the follow-up to that.
Oh, aha. So I think the closest thing that we're gonna get is Apex defined types, right? That's certainly something that you can experiment with. I'm not readily aware of whether or not maps are supported in Apex defined types at the moment. I have heard generally from the team that we're trying to get as close to kind of a generic object structure as we can. That may or may not be relevant to your question, but I sure would love being able to just have generic Apex defined variables that I could use everywhere.
Excellent. All right, so Doug follows up with another one, and this is something I have not run into yet, so I'm really glad he asked this question. When I use a scheduled or asynchronous path, the variables I set prior on the immediate path get wiped out. Is there any way around this?
Ooh. I don't know offhand. I'd love to know if Jen has experienced that at all. I was unaware of that behavior.
Interesting. So Maria's chiming in with get the record again with the ID. Jen says she has not experienced it. Maria said she mentioned it to Rakesh. Maria
Okay.
followed up with it happens if you have multiple subflows from one main record triggered flow. And Doug, no problem on the questions. We love the questions. Keep them coming.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So, okay, so each auto launch can get it again. It's not super efficient, but it works. Seems to be the going.
From flow to flow that removes it.
Yeah, seems to be the going answer for now. Okay, so we've got that one. Aiden would like to know, are there any plans to make flows like triggers or classes so they can only be created in a sandbox and have to be deployed to production as opposed to being able to build them directly in prod?
So I haven't heard anything that is tied to this idea. I would say that from like a governance perspective, it's possible to handle this with like soft structures, like business structures and business processes. You could also manage it with settings. I've worked in orgs where, you know, I was primarily responsible for production. I had full admin access to production. I've also worked at companies as an admin where I had zero access to production because my job was to do stuff in our lower environments. That was a great way to stop me from building flows in production. I really wouldn't have done it either way, but you know, when you don't have the option, you don't have the option. Outside of that, I haven't heard anything about like us changing the kind of governance side of things. Yeah, you could probably do it through permissions just to remove the access but I don't think there's any kind of formal structure surrounding the tool.
Okay, sounds good. Alan says, please no. I hope it was in response to that based on when the question came in. Justin did want to say thanks. This was a fantastic or amazing webinar.
Oh, thank you.
So P would like to know, are there any enhancements coming to the collection sort element, like a way to mark in flow, not on the actual record, which records have gone through the sort already? So collection sort is new enough. I haven't even played with it yet. So
yeah, I mean, it's so difficult when we talk about future stuff, because most of the time, especially when we're talking about really popular products like Flow Builder, I think the answer is yeah, probably. But because I'm not a part of the long range planning of the roadmap over there, and because release to release things get reprioritized, I can't say with any degree of certainty or accuracy when and if that's going to be delivered, right? We could have it, on the docket internally to be delivered in, 2 quarters, and then based on some kind of really important change in industries, it's, deprioritized. I hope so. I'm with you. I hope so.
And I will join you in hoping so there. Okay, deep-a-deep-a-deep-a-dee. Jennifer Lee says, great job, Jay.
Oh, thank you, Jennifer Lee.
Marie chimes back in, Maria, with, you're such a dynamic speaker. I think I learned just as much about presenting complex data as the content itself.
Oh, good.
So, we just like to make you feel good around here. Jamie would like to chime in, just putting this out there, and it's not a criticism of Jay, but it seems like Salesforce makes recommendations on how to optimally do something. Admins want to do it, but when it comes down to implementation, we're often hamstrung by the system in a way where we can't actually do what's recommended. So just wanted the Salesforce team to be aware of that. I think it's probably a source of frustration going, we're trying to do what you tell us to do, but we can't do what you're telling us to do. So now what do we do?
So as an admin EV, like, I consider my boss and my customer to be the Salesforce community of admins. Whether or not the person who put that comment into the chat is an admin or a developer or business analyst or whatever, I would love to hear more from you. My DMs in Twitter are open, my email address, I'm happy to have a conversation with you or hear your point of view. Because when I hear that, the question that gets raised in my mind is, okay, what's preventing you from doing the thing that you want to? Is there, any solution to easing that pain? And what, if anything, because we can't always do everything when we want to, is there anything that is scalable and achievable on my side of things where we could actually start to improve that, right? Because like, real talk, hearing that, I don't like that. That sounds bad. I want that to change. So tell me more about it so I can understand what that is and I can rally for us to improve that.
Excellent. All right. So the one thing I have failed to do so far today is double check the Salesforce community to make sure we don't have anybody asking questions over there. So I'm going to do a quick refresh there. Jamie definitely will reach out to you. And I'm just going to refresh that page in the community one more time. So we'll do a last call for questions, and we appreciate y'all hanging in with us. I know this is our 3rd consecutive automation hour that's going past the 60-minute mark. So I think we're setting records left and right today.
It's so funny. Before we began today, I was looking at the presentation and I was talking with everyone and was saying like, hey, I hope we get to an hour, but I'm not sure if we have the full hour of content. I'm really glad that we got questions. It's fun to get questions and to kind of work through the things that are on the minds of our community.
All right. Well, good news. I think I have actually gotten through every question we have for you.
Woohoo! Look at that. We did it, y'all. We did it. We did it together. My washer in the background is playing a little song.
Phenomenal. And Jen also chimed in, if anyone on the call has thoughts on content that would help you learn Flow, Jen would like to curate that and hear from you about it. So please DM her on Twitter at Jen W. Lee. If you don't follow her, you totally should. And if you need her Twitter handle or Jay's contact information, please reach out to us. We can get you in touch.
Yeah, I need to say this again very, very strongly and very, very loudly to anyone that is still on the call. If you have feedback about content that you need to see so that you can become a master of Flow, this is literally the best time in the world to start communicating that to us. Jen is where you should probably go for most of the, hey, this is the content that I'd like. But I'd love to hear any issues or challenges that you have outside of that, right? That previous question was a great example of the kind of stuff that I'm interested in diving into. Yeah, well, thank you very much, everyone. What a fun session. Always love being here. Thanks to the Automation Hour team for having me. I always like interacting with y'all. Anything else? Is that it? That's it. It's over.
Okay, where can I get the flow content? Doug says, thank you, but I'm going to butcher this name, so I apologize. Gayatri wants to know where we can get the flow content. So today's session, we have recorded it. It will be up on YouTube as soon as we get it done processing, and a copy of the content, including resources, will be attached in the description on the YouTube video. Generally, it takes us a couple hours to get it rendered and posted. So, but for sure you can find it there.
Cool.
All right, with that, y'all, we're 11 minutes over. So nice job. We appreciate all the questions and everyone attending. Jay, thank you so much for presenting. This has been a very timely and helpful topic.
Absolutely.
So I hope
Thanks for having me, and all y'all have a great weekend.
you as well. Thanks all, and we'll see you next time.